Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into a really fascinating period, the interwar years, 1919 to 1940. It's all about how the major armies tried to grapple with, well, the lessons of the Great War and that horrifying stalemate.
Exactly. And this period, especially looking at Germany and France, it's such a crucial case study. You know, how institutions learn, or sometimes how they fail to learn. You have these two major powers, both coming out of the same incredibly traumatic experience, World War I.
Right.
But they end up with completely different ideas about technology, about command, about, well, what the next war would even look like. Diametrically opposed, really.
So our mission today is to unpack all that. The doctrine, the decisions made in Paris and Berlin, which were often, tangled up in politics and bureaucracy. We'll look at their core beliefs and then follow those ideas right onto the battlefield. Specifically, that breakthrough at Sedan in May 1940.
Which was just catastrophic for the French.
Absolutely. And it really becomes a story less about who had the better tank, though we'll touch on that, and more about which military organization was better set up to learn, adapt, and frankly, fight effectively.
That's the core of it. And to help us navigate this, we're leaning on some key sources. We've got Robert A. Dowdy's work on French operational art. Really lays bare the rigidity that's set in there.
Okay.
Then there's Karl-Heinz Frieser, who gives us a very detailed German perspective on the 1940 breakthrough. Super valuable.
Right, seeing it from the other side.
And we're also using Williamson Murray and Alan R. Millett's comparative study on armored warfare. That gives us the broader picture. British, French, German experiences really helps put it all in context.
Good stuff.
Oh, and also some insights from S.J. Lewis on the fall of Poland in '39, which was kind of the warm-up act in a grim way.
Okay, so let's start with what feels like a paradox. Germany. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles hits them hard. Limits on the army, forbidden from having tanks, aircraft. Yet barely 20 years later, they emerge with what seems like the most powerful, most effective doctrine for mechanized war. How did that happen?
Well, it's fascinating because the result looked revolutionary, right?
Mm-hmm.
Blitzkrieg. But the method was actually, well, evolutionary. Deeply evolutionary. It wasn't one person having a sudden brainwave. It was built on this really deliberate, honest, and frankly, quite rigorous institutional look at what went wrong and right in the Great War.
Honesty after a defeat? That sounds hard for any large organization. How do they manage that? How did General Hans von Seeckt, who was leading the Reichswehr then, make sure it wasn't just, papering over cracks?
Seeckt is key. He saw the treaty limitations not just as a restriction, but almost as an opportunity. A chance to rebuild, keep the best of the Prussian military tradition, but discard the baggage. And he did it systematically. Right after the war, he set up these committees, not one or two, but 57 committees.
57?
That's a lot.
It's a huge number. We're talking over 400 officers involved.
Yeah.
That's more than 10% of the entire officer corps they were allowed at the time.
Wow.
And their job. Produce short, concise studies. Look at pre-war ideas, look at the new weapons, the new situations, and crucially, the unsolved problems. Get the unvarnished truth, as you said.
And they pulled in lessons from all levels, right? Not just generals thinking about strategy.
Absolutely. By involving officers across the ranks, they made sure those hard lessons learned in the trenches by the lieutenants and captains fed directly into the analysis. It wasn't just theory from the top down. This whole massive effort was published between, I think, 1920 and 1925, The Experience of the World War. And that became the bedrock for their new doctrine.
So this deep dive into their own failures and successes directly shaped the rulebooks that followed. Directly. It led first to Army Regulation 487, which was called Leadership and Battle with Combined Arms. Then later, and maybe more famously, Truppenführung, or Troop Leadership, published in 33 and 36. And these weren't just manuals, they enshrined a whole philosophy. Two key things really stand out.
Okay, what were they?
First, an absolute belief in maneuver warfare. Bewegungskrieg, a rejection of getting bogged down. They wanted movement, fluidity.
And the second, this feels critical based on what happened later.
Decentralization. Deep decentralization of operations. This is where Auftragstaktik comes in mission-oriented tactics.
Explain that a bit more. What did it mean in practice?
It meant pushing decision-making down to the lowest possible level. The officer, or even the non-commissioned officer on the ground, who actually sees what's happening. They weren't just allowed to use their initiative, they were required to. Required to lead from the front, act boldly, seize opportunities, even if they lost radio contact, even if the original plan went out the window.
So initiative wasn't just encouraged, it was mandated, written right into the doctrine.
Exactly. Murray and Millett point this out. There's a quote from the manual itself, something like, The emptiness of the battlefield demands fighters who think and act on their own
Right.
and can analyze any situation and exploit it decisively and boldly. It's a fundamental rejection of that top-down, highly controlled approach you saw elsewhere.
So when tanks eventually did come back into the German military picture after the Versailles restrictions loosened.
They slotted right in.
Yeah.
They weren't seen as this completely disruptive new thing that required tearing up the old rulebook.
They weren't a replacement for infantry or artillery?
Not at all. They specifically rejected that all-tang idea that some people, like in Britain, were toying with. For the Germans, tanks were an evolutionary step. They were a tool to make their existing combined arms doctrine faster, more decisive, able to penetrate deeper. It was about incorporating speed and hitting power into their existing maneuver concept.
And how did Truppenführung say they should be used? Was it just about battering through?
The focus was very much on exploitation. The doctrine said tanks were committed to the attack where a decision is sought, meaning you don't just throw them everywhere. You hold them back, wait for the infantry and engineers, maybe supported by air power, to make the initial breach. And then you commit the panzers to drive deep, to get into the enemy's rear, to cause that operational collapse.
And they thought about the logistics, too? Fuel, repair?
Oh, absolutely. They understood the need for coordinated maintenance, lots of radio communication to keep things together, integrated engineers to deal with obstacles. It all flowed from that goal of deep, sustained penetration and encirclement.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Being banned from having tanks actually forced them to study what everyone else was doing.
Exactly. They turned that weakness into a real strength. Because they couldn't build their own tanks for years, they obsessively watched and analyzed foreign experiments. They translated British manuals, like Broad's pamphlet on armored vehicles. They watched British maneuvers in the 1920s and saw the potential for independent, deep operations that some British theorists were advocating.
But maybe weren't implementing fully themselves.
Well, that's a whole other story.
Yeah.
But the Germans took those observations and used them to design their own exercises for when they could have tanks. It created this proactive learning culture. So when the ban was finally lifted in the 1930s, they didn't just get tanks. They already had a mature, well-thought-out concept for how to use them operationally.
Okay, let's shift gears now. France. Victorious in 1918, huge army, long military tradition, plenty of resources. Why didn't their study of the Great War lead to a similar doctrine? Why the rigidity?
It's almost the mirror image. The French reaction to the trauma of World War I wasn't to fundamentally rethink maneuver, but to double down on what they thought had worked in the final stages. And crucially, what might prevent those horrific casualties again.
Millions dead or wounded. That leaves a deep scar on an institution.
A profound scar. And it led them to prioritize avoiding casualties almost above everything else. This reinforced existing tendencies toward centralization and control.
And this led to the doctrine known as the methodical battle.
Precisely, la bataille conduite. It was heavily influenced by figures like General Eugene Debenay and his view of the tightly controlled step-by-step offensives of late 1918. Lots of artillery, infantry advances cautiously, tanks support the infantry. The doctrine basically said you only attack in favorable conditions after the assembling of powerful material means, artillery, tanks, munitions, etc.
It sounds very cautious, almost like a recipe rather than a flexible plan. Guaranteeing tactical success, maybe, but losing strategic agility.
That's exactly Doughty's point in his analysis. The absolute priority was overwhelming firepower before movement. Preparation was everything. And this blurred the lines, Doughty argues, between tactics and operations. He notes how the 1913 manual focused on the conduct of large units' operational thinking.
Yeah.
But the 1936 manual was titled Instructions of the Tactical Employment of Large Units. And a subtle shift in title, but it reveals a profound shift in focus.
So they were thinking about how divisions fight tactically, but not enough about how armies maneuver operationally.
Essentially, yes. Their whole operational concept rested on this foundation of slow, methodical, firepower-heavy tactics. It couldn't cope with speed and surprise.
And needing all that firepower meant keeping the big guns, the artillery, under tight, centralized control.
Yes, very much so. Leaders like Marshal Pétain were big believers in keeping large amounts of artillery under corps or even higher command as a strategic reserve.
Why? What was the fear?
The fear was decentralization would lead to chaos, wasted ammunition, loss of control. They wanted the senior commanders to be able to orchestrate these massive pre-planned barrages. The result, as Gemlin himself noted later, was that in May 1940, France still had 56 regiments of artillery sitting in the General Reserve.
56 regiments, just waiting, not directly supporting the divisions in contact?
Pretty much. Unavailable for the immediate fight where they were desperately needed. It was a system built for a stable, slow-moving battlefield, exactly the opposite of what the Germans were about to unleash.
Contrast that with the Germans pushing initiative down.
Right. The German system allowed divisional commanders, corps commanders, to use the fire support available to them much more quickly and flexibly. The French system just couldn't adapt when things started moving fast.
Were there other issues? Organizational problems that stopped France from adapting? Were people arguing for a more mechanized approach, like de Gaulle?
Oh, definitely. There was significant organizational paralysis. The French high command structure was murky. No clear, single chain of authority, which made it easy for new ideas to get bogged down in committees or blocked by established interests. And you did have voices like Lieutenant Colonel Charles de Gaulle. His book, Towards the Army of the Future, made a powerful case for professional, independent, highly mobile armored divisions.
But his ideas didn't get much traction.
They faced huge resistance. Powerful figures, including Pétain again, just didn't see tanks that way. To them, tanks were infantry support weapons, pure and simple, useful for breaking through bunkers in that methodical battle, but not for driving deep independently. So de Gaulle's proposals were often postponed or watered down into just creating a few small, weak battalions. The system, both doctrinally and politically, just wasn't ready for a real operational mechanized force.
So here's the kicker. France actually had more tanks than Germany in 1940, and some of them, like the Char B-1Bs, were arguably better armed than many German panzers.
Numerically and often qualitatively superior, yes.
Yeah.
But it didn't matter because of how they planned to use them. They were still tied to that methodical battle concept.
Just support weapons.
Exactly. Murray and Millet share this just crushing anecdote from a German officer observing a French exercise. He watched a French tank unit advance in these tight little bounds.
Okay.
And it worked out to about 7 minutes of attack and 70 minutes of waiting for the arrival of the infantry.
70 minutes of waiting.
It completely negates the whole point of having a fast armored vehicle. That rigidity, that doctrinal handcuffing, set the stage for disaster.
Right. So before that disaster unfolded in France, Germany got a chance to test its concepts in Poland in September 1939. Fall Weiss, the invasion of Poland. What did they learn there?
Poland was, well, it was a demonstration that Blitzkrieg could work operationally. Speed, deep penetration, coordinating air and ground forces. It resulted in a quick victory. They achieved several smaller encirclements, like around Radom and Kutno, which broke the back of the Polish army relatively quickly.
But Poland wasn't exactly prepared for that kind of war, were they?
No, S.J. Lewis points this out quite clearly. The Polish army was largely structured and trained along French lines, thinking about the last war. And politically, they felt forced to try and defend their entire border, which meant they were spread thin everywhere, strong nowhere. Military analysts suggested they should have traded space for time, fallen back to major rivers like the Seine and Vistula.
But they didn't.
They didn't. They tried to stand everywhere, and the German speed just overwhelmed them. It forced a war of movement, which was exactly what German doctrine was designed for.
So Poland proved the concept worked. But, true to form, the Germans didn't just pat themselves on the back, did they? They looked for flaws in their own performance.
That's what's so remarkable about their system at this time, that constant learning loop. Despite the swift victory, the High Command, the Oberkommando des Heers, looked critically at the performance, and they found significant weaknesses, particularly in the regular infantry and reserve infantry units. They weren't keeping up, they weren't integrating smoothly enough with the Panzer spearheads.
So what did they do about it?
No rest for the wicked. They launched this incredibly intense training program through the fall and winter of 1939. We're talking 17 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week.
17 hours a day.
Grueling stuff. Focused specifically on improving the fitness, coordination, and combined arms skills of those infantry and reserve units, making sure the whole army could execute this high-tempo warfare, not just the elite panzer divisions. It shows that relentless drive for incremental improvement.
And all this intense preparation was happening just as the plan for invading France, Fall Gelb, underwent a massive change.
Right. The original plan was quite conventional, actually. A main attack through northern Belgium, sort of like a modified Schlieffen plan, aiming to the Gembloux Gap.
But that plan got compromised.
Famously so. The Mechelin incident, a German plane carrying the plans, crashed in Belgium in January 1940. The Allies got hold of parts of the plan,
Which forced the Germans to rethink everything.
It created an opening for a much more radical idea, championed primarily by General Erich von Manstein, who was then Chief of Staff for Army Group A.
Manstein's idea was go through the Ardennes, which everyone thought was impassable for tanks.
Exactly. He argued that the lightly defended Ardennes forest, which the Allies considered a natural tank barrier, was the only place they could achieve strategic surprise now. It was a huge gamble. But the compromise of the old plan, Manstein's persistent lobbying and crucial planning support from General Franz Halder at Army High Command, it led to this dramatic shift.
So the main weight, most of the panzer divisions, were rerouted to punch through the Ardennes.
Aiming to cross the Meuse River, cut behind the Allied armies rushing north into Belgium and trap them. The famous Sichelschnitt, or sickle cut plan.
But the logistics of pushing that much armor through those narrow, winding Ardennes roads, it must have been a nightmare.
Frieser's book details this brilliantly. It was an unprecedented logistical challenge. Panzer Group Kleist alone, which was the main armored fist, over 41,000 vehicles, 1,200 tanks.
How many roads did they have?
Just 4 main roads through the forest for that entire mass. Despite meticulous planning, like using jerry cans for decentralized refueling so tanks didn't have to wait for tankers, it inevitably led to, well, chaos.
Massive traffic jams.
Huge jams. Frieser describes columns stretching back 170 miles at times. Just think about that. One long, vulnerable snake of tanks and trucks. A sitting duck for air attack.
So they were incredibly vulnerable. Were they just betting the Allied air forces wouldn't find them or react fast enough?
That was the gamble. Speed was everything. Not just to achieve the operational objective, but for survival. They had to get through the forest, reach the Meuse, and establish bridgeheads before the Allies realized the main thrust wasn't in Belgium and could redirect their air power onto those choked roads. The shock and speed had to paralyze the Allied response.
Okay, so that sets the stage for the absolute crunch point. Crossing the Meuse River, particularly at Sedan, on May 13th, 1940. This is where the French Second Army, under General Hunsker, basically collapsed.
Sedan is the hinge upon which the entire campaign turned. And the German success there wasn't just about better tanks or tactics in isolation. It was this perfect storm, as you said, German audacity meeting French operational and tactical failure.
The first big French error seems to have happened before the Germans even reached the Meuse. Gamelin, the commander-in-chief, sending his best mobile forces way up north.
A catastrophic miscalculation. Gamelin was utterly wedded to Plan D, the Dial Plan. He was convinced the main German attack had to come through Belgium, the traditional route. So he sent his best, most mobile force, the 7th Army, racing towards Antwerp and the Dial Line to link up with the Dutch and Belgians.
Leaving the center, the Ardennes front, relatively weak.
Dangerously weak. And critically, it meant he'd committed his main operational reserve, the Master Maneuver, far away from where the decisive blow would actually fall. He had nothing left to react quickly in the center.
And the Germans, under Guderian leading the panzers, aimed right for that weak spot defended by Hunziker's Second Army.
Exactly. And even within the Second Army's sector, Hunziker made errors. He assumed, like Gamelin, that any threat through the Ardennes would be minor. So he put his strongest units facing the Maginot Line further east. The crucial sector, the hinge point near Sedan, he assigned to his weakest unit, the 55th Infantry Division.
What was wrong with the 55th?
It was a Series B division. Fewer active duty officers, mostly reservists, less training, lower morale, poorer equipment. And to make matters worse,
There's more.
the troops of the 55th had been constantly pulled off the line for weeks beforehand to do construction work on the defenses. Digging trenches, building bunkers.
So they weren't training together. They weren't even familiar with their specific defensive positions. Unit cohesion must have been terrible.
Absolutely terrible. They were put into a critical spot, unprepared and disjointed. Then came the German approach.
And the Germans didn't just roll up. They used air power in a terrifying new way. Vertical artillery, they called it.
Yes. Guderian requested and got massive air support for the crossing. Nearly 1,500 aircraft, mostly Stuka dive bombers, concentrated over Sedan. It was described as an endless rolling operation, not necessarily aimed at physically destroying every bunker, but at shattering the defenders' nerves, cutting communications, paralyzing them with fear.
And the psychological impact was huge.
Immense. Reports later said the psychological shock was greater than the first use of tanks back in World War I. Just constant noise, explosions, dive bombing attacks.
But the actual collapse, the breakthrough itself on May 13th, wasn't directly caused by bombs destroying defenses or tanks smashing through.
This is the most stunning part, detailed vividly by Frieser. The collapse of the main French line at Sedan was triggered by panic. Pure psychological breakdown. The Panic of Bulsen. A false rumor started spreading like wildfire among the terrified troops of the 55th Division. German tanks are at Bulsen. Bulsen was a village several miles behind the main line of defense.
But German tanks hadn't even crossed the Meuse yet.
Not a single German tank had crossed the river at that point. It was pure phenomena, hallucination, collective mass delusion. But the rumor was enough. Believing they were cut off and overrun, units of the 55th Division just disintegrated. They abandoned their positions, fled rearwards. The division effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force within hours.
All based on a phantom fear.
Exactly. German war diaries confirm the 1st Panzers only got across the Meuse something like 12 hours after that initial panic broke the French line. It shows how German methods, speed, surprise, psychological shock could break the enemy's will even before the physical battle was fully joined.
Unbelievable. So once the Germans were across establishing pontoon bridges, the Allies realized the danger and threw everything they had into bombing those bridges on May 14th.
A massive effort.
Right.
The Royal Air Force and the French Air Force committed over 150 bombers, escorted by about 250 fighters. Their mission? Cut Guderian's lifeline, destroy those bridges.
But it failed. Catastrophically, according to the sources.
Utterly catastrophic losses for the Allies. The RAF, in particular, took a brutal beating. Out of 72 ferry battle and Blenheim bombers sent, only 40 came back. One source called it the highest loss rate the RAF had ever experienced or would ever experience in a single day.
Why were the losses so high? Was it just the Luftwaffe fighters?
Fighters played a role, but the real killer was the German anti-aircraft artillery, the flak. Guderian knew his bridges were vital and vulnerable. He'd concentrated around 303 flak guns, from heavy 88s down to lighter cannons, in a dense ring around the crossing sites.
300 guns just waiting for them.
Exactly. And the Allied attacks weren't well coordinated. Instead of one massive, overwhelming wave, they came in piecemeal. 27 separate attacks throughout the day, often just 10 or 20 planes at a time. The concentrated German flak just tore them apart.
Another failure of concentration, then. Let's go back to the ground. The French doctrine for dealing with a breakthrough was this idea of colmater, sealing the breach.
Yes, colmater literally means to plug or seal something. The idea was, if the enemy made a small penetration, local reserves would move in to contain it, slow the enemy down. Then, once the enemy was halted, you'd carefully prepare a methodical counterattack with strong artillery support to push them back out.
But the whole concept relies on the enemy advance being slow, right? Methodical like their own.
Completely. It assumes you have time. Time to identify the breach, time to move reserves laterally, time to assemble artillery, time for the commanders to make decisions through that centralized system.
And at Sedan, that time just wasn't there. The execution of colmater failed.
It failed utterly. General LaFontaine, commanding the sector where the 55th Division had collapsed, received orders to counterattack immediately. But he hesitated.
Why?
He delayed for about 9 critical hours. Schooled in the methodical battle, he wanted to organize a proper artillery preparation first, rather than just throwing his remaining infantry and whatever tanks he had straight at the breach.
9 hours.
9 hours. In that time, the German bridgehead solidified. Guderian got the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions across in strength. The window for a quick local colmater slammed shut.
So the local reaction failed. What about a bigger operational level counterattack? Did the French High Command try anything?
They did try. They scraped together what reserves they had left in the area, primarily the newly formed 3rd Armored Division and the 3rd Motorized Infantry Division under General Flavigny. This was Group Flavigny.
This was their main operational reserve shot.
Pretty much the last roll of the dice in that sector. Flavigny himself had actually argued for tanks pre-war, but even he fell victim to the system's flaws. He was urged not to attack immediately on the 14th. Instead, he delayed for another 10 critical hours, supposedly to refuel and service his tanks.
More delay.
More fatal delay. And when Group Flavigny finally did engage, Flavigny didn't concentrate his armor for a decisive punch. Instead, he spread his tanks out thinly in a defensive line, trying to act as corks to plug the gaps along roads.
The exact opposite of how the Germans were using their panzers.
Completely. It was a linear defense against a concentrated breakthrough force. It failed completely. The colmater concept, the entire French approach to dealing with a breach, proved totally inadequate against the speed and focus of the German combined arms assault.
So the breakthrough was complete, the bridgehead secure. Now came the exploitation, the famous race to the channel. This is where Auftrag's tactic, that decentralized command, really showed its worth, but also caused friction within the German command itself.
Absolutely. The sheer speed of the Panzer thrust westward was a stunning demonstration of Auftrag's tactic. But Fraser shows it wasn't smooth sailing internally for the Germans. The commanders at the front were moving so fast, they were literally outrunning the plans and the nerves of their own superiors back at headquarters.
Guderian himself, after crossing the Meuse, immediately pushed west. That was a huge gamble, wasn't it? Leaving his flanks potentially exposed.
A massive gamble. He faced that classic choice: secure the bridgehead tactically or exploit the enemy's confusion operationally. He chose exploitation. He ordered the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions to drive west towards the coast immediately, betting that the French response would be too slow and too predictable to hit his flanks effectively.
And relying on the following German infantry divisions to secure the ground behind him.
Exactly. Units like the 10th Panzer Division and the elite infantry regiment Grossdeutschland were tasked with widening and securing the bridgehead, allowing Guderian's spearheads to just keep going. It was Auftragstaktik in action, trusting subordinates to handle their missions while the lead elements maintained momentum.
And then you have General Erwin Rommel with the 7th Panzer Division, perhaps the most famous example of this kind of initiative, the Ghost Division.
Rommel was the embodiment of Auftragstaktik, almost to an extreme. His 7th Panzer Division surged forward so fast, often ignoring orders to halt, that he frequently lost radio contact with his own corps headquarters. His division appeared seemingly out of nowhere, deep in the Allied rear, hence the French nickname. La Division Fantôme, the Ghost Division. His boldness was astonishing.
There's that incredible story about his night attack.
Yes, on the night of May 16th, attacking with tanks at night was considered highly unorthodox, even dangerous. But Rommel didn't care. He led his panzers straight through the sleeping bivouac area of the French 5th Motorized Infantry Division, just drove down the road, firing left and right into the camps.
The French division just dissolved.
Completely disintegrated. Woken from sleep by tanks firing amongst them, they broke and fled as refugees. Operationally, the result was stunning. Rommel's division took around 10,000 prisoners that night. His own losses: fewer than 36 men.
That's turning a tactical surprise into a complete operational rout.
Precisely what Auftragstaktik enabled. Seize the fleeting opportunity, act boldly, and the results could be disproportionately huge.
But this incredible speed, Guderian racing west, Rommel disappearing off the map, it made the higher commanders nervous, created a rear battle within the German command.
Immensely nervous. You had this conflict between the frontline commanders like Guderian and Rommel pushing the limits, and the more traditionalist commanders in the rear like General von Kleist, Guderian's immediate superior. Kleist actually briefly relieved Guderian of command for advancing too far, too fast, ignoring an order to halt. Guderian claimed the order hadn't reached him or was misunderstood. Classic Auftragstaktik justification, perhaps.
And even Hitler got worried.
Even Hitler. The sources say he became extremely nervous. He was afraid the panzers were overextending themselves, that their flanks were too vulnerable. He kept trying to order halts. General Halder, the Army Chief of Staff, wrote in his diary that the Führer was afraid of his own success.
Afraid of success. That's quite something.
It highlights that tension that the very doctrine enabling the stunning success also created anxiety at the highest levels. But despite the halts and the arguments,
The panzers kept rolling.
they kept rolling. By May 20th, Guderian's lead elements reached Abbeville, right on the English Channel coast.
Cutting off the northern Allied armies.
Completely severed. The British Expeditionary Force, the best divisions of the French First Army, the Belgian Army, maybe 1.7 million men trapped in Flanders, cut off from their supplies and the rest of France. The sickle cut was complete. The French attempt to form a new line under General Touchant to block the gap failed. They pulled back, opening the path west. The concept of Colmater was dead.
So bringing this all together, it really comes back to that fundamental difference in how France and Germany learned or didn't learn from World War I.
It's stark, isn't it? The French studied the war intensely, had immense resources, brave soldiers. But they drew the wrong conclusions. Their focus on the methodical battle, on centralization, on minimizing casualties above all else. It led to a doctrine that simply couldn't cope with modern mobile warfare. As Dowdy puts it, they failed to distinguish clearly between tactics and operations. Their system actively stifled the initiative needed to fight a fast-moving enemy. It never approached the sophistication of operational art the Germans achieved.
Whereas the Germans, even under severe limitations, built a system based on maneuver, decentralization, and initiative.
Through that honest self-assessment Sieg started, they built a doctrine Auftragstaktik, combined arms that encouraged adaptation. They leveraged tactical advantages into this shattering operational victory. Their system was culturally and structurally prepared for speed.
So the Blitzkrieg of 1940 wasn't necessarily some unpredictable bolt from the blue, a total revolution in military affairs in itself.
Not entirely. It was more like an incremental, systemic improvement of an already flexible doctrine meeting an opponent whose doctrine was fatally flawed and rigid. The revolution looks so dramatic because the French operational errors were so catastrophic. At its heart, the fall of France in 1940 was, as the historians argue, a military event largely explicable by military causes. The failure of the French army and its high command to adapt its thinking.
Which leaves us with a really interesting final thought for you, the listener, especially thinking about that German rear battle where success made even Hitler nervous.
Right. The 1940 campaign showed the Panzers didn't just outrun the Allies. They outran their own leadership's comfort zone. Guderian was pushing, Kleist was pulling back, Hitler was hesitant. So the question for today's military organizations is this. If knowledge and doctrine are only valuable when applied decisively, what mechanisms do you need to encourage bold action and initiative, especially when success starts to exceed expectations? How do you prevent that nervous halt from the top, triggered by the fear of success itself? How does organizational culture truly enable doctrine, even when things are going unexpectedly well?